the eagle that was watching me from above, and the dark reason behind it left me. In shock, I had been lost for 2 days when I noticed that a giant eagle was circling above me, repeating the same flight pattern, always following me. At first I thought it was coincidence, but as hunger increased and night approached, I noticed it never went away. Every time I tried to change direction, the eagle changed too, as if it were watching me. When I started hearing strange noises in the woods, the bird dove low over my head, forcing me to walk in the opposite direction. Only later did I understand that the sound in the forest wasn't the wind, and that the eagle was guiding me away from something I should never have found. The forest began to swallow me, the exact moment I realized I had taken the wrong path. But by then it was too late to turn back. The sun was beginning to set between the dense canopies of the trees, and every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into that infinite green that smelled of wet moss and damp earth. I had left the marked trail at least 3 hours ago, maybe 4. My cell phone hadn't had signal since noon, and the battery was at 12%, tucked in my pocket like a useless weight that only reminded me how isolated I was from the civilized world. My backpack weighed on my shoulders with the few provisions that remained: 2 crushed granola bars, a half-full water bottle, and a pocket knife I prayed I wouldn't need to use. The map I had brought was so dirty with mud and folded wrong that it no longer made any sense. The blue lines of the streams mixed with brown stains, and I could no longer identify where the hell I was. The only certainty I had was that I needed to find running water, follow the flow until I reached some road or settlement. But the forest here was different from the tourist trails I knew. Here the trees grew crooked and too close to each other, their branches intertwined, forming a dark green ceiling that filtered sunlight in thin vertical rays, creating a perpetual twilight that made my stomach turn with anxiety. Every sound made me stop and look around: the snap of a twig, the rustling of dry leaves, the distant cry of some animal I couldn't identify. My heart was beating too fast, and my hands trembled slightly as I pushed low branches away from my face. Small scratches burned on my arms, and the legs of my pants were soaked with dew and mud. I tried to stay calm, breathe deeply, and think rationally. But the panic was there, latent, waiting for the right moment to explode in my chest. It was on the second day, when desperation had already fully settled in, and hunger was beginning to hurt like a constant cramp in the pit of my stomach, that I noticed the eagle for the first time. I was trying to climb a rocky elevation to get a better view of the area and maybe identify some reference on the horizon when I heard the sound, a sharp and prolonged cry that echoed above the treetops. I looked up, and there it was, an enormous bird with open wings that seemed to span more than 6 feet. Its feathers were dark brown, with golden details that shone when sunlight hit them, and it glided in wide, slow circles right above me, so close that I could see the details of its head, the curved yellowish beak, the small penetrating eyes that seemed fixed directly on me. It was a golden eagle, I was sure. I had seen photos of them in documentaries, but never in person. And the magnitude of the creature in real life was absolutely terrifying. Those talons looked capable of tearing chunks of flesh with ease. The beak could pierce skulls, and there it was, circling above me as if evaluating whether I would be a viable prey. I waved my arms and shouted, trying to scare it away, but it didn't move. It continued its hypnotic circular flight, always maintaining the same distance. the same rhythmic pattern that made me feel like I was being studied, analyzed, measured for something I couldn't comprehend. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just a coincidence, that the bird was probably hunting for rodents or rabbits in the area, and my presence was irrelevant to it. So I continued walking, pushing through thick undergrowth and jumping over fallen logs covered in moss and fungi. My boots sank into soft ground with every step, and the sound of my own breathing seemed too loud in the oppressive silence of the forest. But when I looked up again, 20 minutes later, the eagle was still there, directly above me, maintaining that same circular pattern, and a cold shiver ran down my spine, because this was no longer a coincidence. This was deliberate, intentional. The bird was following me. The afternoon dragged on with agonizing slowness, and the eagle never left. Every time I glanced up through gaps in the canopy, I could see that massive silhouette gliding in circles. Sometimes it would cry out, that piercing shriek that seemed to cut through the air itself. And I began to wonder if maybe I was hallucinating, if dehydration and exhaustion were making me see things that weren't really there. But no, the bird was real, absolutely real. I could see individual feathers ruffling in. The wind could see the way its head turned to track my movements below, and the rational part of my mind tried to explain it away. Eagles have large territories. Maybe I just happened to be walking through its hunting ground. Maybe it was curious about this strange two-legged creature stumbling through its domain. But the primal part of my brain, the ancient survival instinct that had kept my ancestors alive, was screaming that something was wrong, that this wasn't normal behavior, that I was in danger even if I couldn't yet understand the nature of that danger. My pace quickened involuntarily, my legs moving faster, even though I had no clear destination. The forest seemed to grow darker around me as clouds moved across the sky, filtering out what little sunlight had been penetrating the canopy. Shadows lengthened and merged, turning the spaces between trees into pools of blackness, where anything could be hiding, watching, waiting, and still the eagle circled, tireless, patient, as if it had all the time in the world. When the third day dawned, I woke up shivering and soaked with dew, curled up against the base of a massive oak tree where I had collapsed the night before, too exhausted to build any kind of shelter. My clothes were damp and cold against my skin, my muscles ached from lying on the hard ground, and my tongue felt thick and swollen in my dry mouth. The water bottle was empty. I had drunk the last drops the previous evening, and now I was facing the very real possibility of severe dehydration. My lips were cracked and bleeding. My head pounded with a dull, persistent ache, and when I tried to stand up, the world tilted sickeningly, and I had to grab the tree trunk to keep from falling. I needed water desperately, needed food, needed to find my way out of this nightmare. But when I looked up through the morning mist that hung between the trees like ghostly curtains, I saw it immediately, the eagle, perched on a high branch about 50 yards away, its body perfectly still except for its head, which turned slowly to fix me with that intense predatory stare. We looked at each other for a long moment, and I felt something shift inside me, a deep, instinctive fear that went beyond rational thought. This wasn't just a bird anymore. This was a presence, an entity that had chosen to attach itself to me for reasons I couldn't fathom, and as I watched, it spread those enormous wings, pushed off from the branch, and began to circle again. The same pattern, the same height, the same deliberate surveillance. I started walking again because what else could I do? Staying still meant death. The forest floor was covered in fallen leaves that crunched loudly under my boots, announcing my presence to everything in the vicinity. Spiderwebs stretched across the path at face height, their silk threads sticking to my skin and hair, and I brushed them away with increasingly frantic movements. Small insects buzzed around my head, attracted by my sweat and the smell of fear that I was surely emanating. The terrain was becoming more difficult, the ground sloping downward at a steep angle, forcing me to grab onto branches and roots to keep from sliding. Loose rocks shifted under my weight and went tumbling down the hillside, creating small avalanches of dirt and stone. And through it all, the eagle remained above me, visible whenever I passed through a clearing or looked up through a gap in the canopy. Its presence had become almost comforting in a strange way. At least it was something constant in this chaotic wilderness. At least I wasn't completely alone, even if my only companion was a predator that might be waiting for me to collapse so it could feast on my flesh. The thought made me laugh, a harsh, bitter sound that startled a flock of smaller birds from a nearby tree. They exploded upward in a flurry of wings and panicked chirping, and the eagle barely reacted. It just kept circling, circling, circling. The forest began to change as I descended, the trees growing farther apart, the underbrush thinning out, and I could see more sky now, pale gray and threatening rain. The air felt heavier, charged with electricity, and distant thunder rumbled like the growl of some massive beast. I needed to find shelter before the storm hit. Needed to get off this exposed hillside, but my legs were barely responding to commands anymore. Each step was an act of will. My body was shutting down, running on fumes, and I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't last much longer. One more day maybe, perhaps two if I was lucky, before dehydration and starvation would finish what the forest had started. I thought about my family, wondered if they had reported me missing yet, if search parties were combing these woods looking for any sign of me. But I had told no one exactly where I was going, had been stupid and arrogant, thinking I could handle a simple hiking trip alone, and now I was paying the price. For that arrogance, tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away. Crying would only dehydrate me further, would waste precious moisture that my body desperately needed. So I kept walking, kept putting one foot in front of the other, kept ignoring the burning in my legs and the knife-sharp pain in my empty stomach. That's when I heard it, the sound that would change everything. It started as a low rumble that I initially mistook for more thunder, but it was different, more constant, more rhythmic, like heavy drums beating in some ancient ritual. And it was coming from somewhere ahead of me. Down in the valley where the trees grew thick and dark again, I stopped walking and listened, trying to identify the source, and the sound grew louder, clearer. Not drums, but something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up and sent ice water through my veins. It was voices, multiple voices, chanting in unison, rising and falling in a cadence that was definitely not natural. Not random but structured, purposeful. And woven through the chanting was another sound, high-pitched and terrible, a sound that could only be screaming. Humans screaming, full of agony and terror and desperation. I stood frozen, my mind refusing to process what my ears were telling me, because this couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. I was lost in a national forest in the 21st century. Not in some horror movie, but the sounds continued, grew even louder. And I realized with dawning horror that I had been walking straight toward whatever was making those sounds, had been heading directly towards something that I should absolutely avoid at all costs. I started to back away slowly, carefully, trying not to make any noise. But I had only taken 3 steps when the eagle shrieked, that piercing cry that seemed impossibly loud, and suddenly the bird was diving, dropping out of the sky like a missile, wings tucked back, talons extended, heading straight for my head. I threw myself sideways, crashed into a tree, and felt the rush of air as the eagle passed within inches of my skull. So close that I felt the wind from its wings, smelled the musky, predator scent of its body, and then it was climbing again, circling back for another pass. I scrambled to my feet and ran in the opposite direction from the voices, ran uphill even though my legs screamed in protest, ran with branches whipping my face and roots trying to trip me. And behind me I could hear the eagle's wings beating the air, could hear it gaining on me. And just when I thought those talons were going to sink into my back and tear me apart, the bird veered off, climbed high again, and resumed its circular pattern. But this time it was circling ahead of me, in the direction I was now running, as if approving of my choice, as if guiding me away from whatever horror waited in that valley. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsed behind a fallen log, and lay there gasping, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst through my ribcage. The sounds from the valley had faded, swallowed by distance and the thick forest. But I could still hear them echoing in my mind, those voices, that screaming. What the hell was down there? Who was down there? And why had they chosen this remote location for whatever twisted thing they were doing? I had heard stories of course, urban legends about cults in the wilderness, about rituals and sacrifices, but I had always dismissed them as nonsense. The fantasies of conspiracy theorists and true crime addicts. Yet here I was, having nearly stumbled directly into something that should not exist, something that made every survival instinct in my body scream, run, hide, get away. And the eagle had stopped me, had forced me to change direction, had quite possibly saved my life. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I looked up, searching the sky, and there it was, still circling. But its pattern had changed. It was moving now, drifting slowly in a specific direction. Northwest, if my sense of orientation was at all reliable, and after a moment I understood. It was showing me the way, leading me somewhere, and I had to make a choice. Trust this wild creature that had been stalking me for 2 days, or strike out on my own and risk circling back toward that nightmare in the valley. I chose to follow the eagle. What other option did I have? I was lost, exhausted, running on empty. And something in that bird's behavior had shifted from predatory to protective. Or maybe I was just delirious, my mind creating narratives to make sense of random events. But either way, following the eagle gave me purpose, gave me direction, gave me something to focus on besides my own impending death. So I stood up, every muscle protesting, and started walking in the direction the bird was leading. The terrain began to level out, the trees to thin, and after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes, I heard a new sound, the most beautiful sound in the world, running water, a stream. I stumbled toward it, breaking through underbrush and nearly falling down a small embankment, and there it was. A clear stream flowing over smooth rocks, the water so transparent I could see every pebble on the bottom. I fell to my knees at the edge and plunged my face into the ice-cold water, drank in great gulping swallows, not caring that I was supposed to be careful about giardia and other waterborne parasites. not caring about anything except the blessed relief of water filling my mouth and throat, washing away the dust and dryness, bringing life back to my dehydrated cells. I don't know how long I stayed by that stream, drinking and resting and slowly recovering enough strength to think clearly again. The eagle had landed in a tree on the opposite bank, settled on a thick branch where it could watch me. And now that I wasn't running or panicking, now that I had water and a moment to breathe, I could really observe it, study its features, and I noticed things I hadn't before. The bird was old. I could tell by the worn appearance of some of its feathers, by a slight irregularity in its posture, and there was something in its eyes, an intelligence that seemed almost human, as if it understood far more than a wild animal should. We looked at each other across the water, and I felt a connection form, fragile and inexplicable, a bond between two living things who had both survived against odds, who had both faced the darkness of this forest and emerged changed. I raised my hand slowly, not in threat, but in acknowledgement, in gratitude, and the eagle tilted its head, watching, evaluating, and then it opened its beak and made a sound. Not the piercing shriek I had heard before, but something softer, almost conversational. A series of clicks and low calls that seemed directed at me specifically, telling me something, trying to communicate across the barrier of species. I followed the stream, the eagle following me, and gradually the forest began to change again, becoming more familiar, the trees spacing out to the proper distance, the undergrowth taking on the manicured appearance of a maintained trail. And then I saw it. A wooden marker post with faded yellow paint, and beyond it the distinct impression of a hiking path. I had found my way back to civilization, or at least to the edge of it. Tears came again, but this time I didn't try to stop them. I let them flow, let out all the fear and stress and terror that I'd been holding inside for 3 days. I cried like a child, sobbing and gasping, and when I finally looked up, the eagle was descending, landing on the ground just a few feet in front of me, close enough that I could have reached out and touched it if I had been brave enough or stupid enough to try. We stayed like that for a long moment, man and bird, sharing something that transcended words or reason, and then I understood finally. Understood what the eagle had been doing. It hadn't been stalking me as prey. It had been watching over me, protecting me, guiding me away from danger that I hadn't even known existed. And when I had been about to walk into the worst kind of trouble, it had intervened, had forced me onto a different path, had quite literally saved my life. The eagle spread its wings, massive and magnificent, caught an updraft and began to rise, spiraling higher and higher into the afternoon sky. And I watched it go, watched until it was just a dark speck against the clouds, and then it was gone, vanished into the vastness of the wilderness, leaving me alone but safe, alive but forever changed by what I had experienced. I started walking down the trail, my legs finding new strength, and within an hour I heard voices, real voices this time, not chanting but laughing and talking, a group of hikers coming up the path, and when they saw me, saw my condition, the torn clothes and scratches and obvious distress, they immediately offered help, offered water and food and a call to the ranger station, and I accepted gratefully. Let them lead me back toward the trailhead and safety and the world of rules and reason that I had been missing. But I never told them about the eagle, never explained what had really happened out there in the deep woods. How could I? They would have thought I was crazy. suffering from exposure and delirium, and maybe I was. Maybe the whole thing had been a hallucination brought on by dehydration and fear. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had heard, and more importantly, I knew what I had been saved from, because 2 days later, after I had recovered and been released from the hospital, where they had rehydrated me and treated my injuries and declared me lucky to be alive, I saw the news report. Rangers had found something in the forest. In a valley, approximately 3 miles from where I had been, they had found evidence of illegal activity. Disturbing activity. The kind that involved missing persons and shallow graves and crimes so heinous that the investigators were still processing the scene, still trying to understand the full scope of what had occurred there, and according to the coordinates they gave, I had been walking straight toward that location where something had changed my path, when something had intervened and forced me in a different direction. I drove back to that forest one more time. Months later, when the investigation had concluded and the area had been opened back up to the public, I hiked back to the stream where I had found water, where I had felt that connection with the eagle, and I stood there in the dappled sunlight, listening to the water flow over rocks, and I looked up at the sky, searching, hoping, and for just a moment I thought I saw something, a dark shape circling high above the tree line, wings spread wide, gliding on thermals that only it could feel, and I raised my hand in salute, in thanks, in acknowledgement of a debt I could never repay, the debt I owed to a wild creature that had chosen, for reasons I would never fully understand, to watch over a lost human stumbling through its territory, to guide me away from evil that wore human faces, to save my life at a moment when I didn't even know I needed saving, and whether it was instinct or intelligence, chance or choice, the eagle had changed everything, had altered the course of my existence with its presence, and I would carry that with me forever, the memory of those 3 days in the wilderness, the memory of being lost and found and saved by something I had initially feared, something that had proven to be my guardian when I had needed one most. And as I turned to walk back down the trail toward my car and my normal life, I whispered a prayer of gratitude to the sky, to the forest, to the eagle that had watched over me from above, and swore that I would never forget, would never take for granted the strange mercy I had been shown, the second chance I had been given, the life I had been allowed to keep because a magnificent bird had decided, for whatever mysterious reason known only to itself, that I was worth saving. I spent the next several weeks trying to return to normal life, but normal felt like a foreign concept now, like a language I had once spoken fluently, but could no longer quite remember. I went back to my job at the architectural firm, sat at my desk surrounded by blueprints and computer screens, attended meetings where people discussed deadlines and budgets and design specifications, and all of it felt absurdly trivial, meaningless, compared to what I had experienced out there in the wilderness. My co-workers noticed the change in me. I could see it in their sidelong glances, in the way conversations would pause when I entered the break room. They knew something had happened. The official story was that I had gotten lost on a hiking trip and been rescued, but the details were vague, and I kept them that way. I couldn't explain the eagle without sounding insane, couldn't describe the sounds I had heard in that valley without seeing skepticism and concern in their eyes, so I said as little as possible, nodded politely when people expressed relief that I was okay, and deflected questions about the specifics with mumbled responses about losing the trail and finding my way back. But at night, alone in my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop replaying every moment in my mind, analyzing every detail, trying to understand what had really happened and why. The news reports about the investigation continued for months. Each new revelation more disturbing than the last. They had found remains, multiple sets of remains, buried in shallow graves throughout that valley. The victims ranged in age from teenagers to elderly adults. People who had gone missing over the past 15 years from various locations across 3 states. Hikers and campers who had vanished without a trace, their families left to wonder and grieve and hope against hope that somehow their loved ones were still alive, but they weren't alive. They had all ended up in that valley, they'd all been taken by a group that the FBI was now calling a highly organized cult, with roots going back decades. The investigation uncovered evidence of systematic abduction, of rituals that investigators refused to describe in detail to the media, citing the ongoing nature of the case and respect for the victims' families. But leaked information painted a picture so horrific that I had to stop reading. I had to turn off the news and sit in silence, trying not to imagine what those people had endured, what I would have endured if the eagle hadn't intervened, if I had continued walking in that direction, if I had stumbled into that clearing where they conducted their ceremonies, because that's what it was, a clearing, a prepared space, with stone formations and fire pits and other structures that suggested long-term use. This wasn't some random crime of opportunity. This was an established operation with multiple participants and careful planning. And somehow I'd been walking straight toward it, completely unaware, exhausted and desperate and vulnerable. The authorities arrested 7 people initially, locals who lived in small towns surrounding the forest, people with normal jobs and families, a school teacher, a postal worker, a retired mechanic. They looked like anyone you might pass on the street, might chat with at a grocery store, and that was perhaps the most terrifying part. The banality of evil, how it could hide behind friendly smiles and ordinary lives. The investigation expanded as more evidence came to light, leading to additional arrests in other states. Apparently the group had connections to similar organizations elsewhere, part of a larger network that authorities were only beginning to understand. And I found myself obsessing over the news coverage, searching online from every article, every update, trying to piece together the full picture, trying to understand how close I had come to becoming another victim. Another set of remains in a shallow grave, another missing person case that would haunt my family for the rest of their lives. The thought made me physically ill, sent me running to the bathroom to vomit. But I couldn't stop researching, couldn't stop trying to understand. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrible. I would be back in that forest, hearing those voices, that screaming. But in the dreams I kept walking toward them. Couldn't stop my legs from moving forward, even though every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run. And I would reach the edge of the clearing and see things, shapes moving in the darkness, faces twisted in agony. And I would try to scream, but no sound would come out. I would try to run, but my legs wouldn't work. And then I would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. And I would lie there in the darkness of my bedroom, trying to convince myself it was just a dream, just my mind processing trauma. But it felt so real, too real. And some nights I was afraid to go back to sleep, afraid of what I might see. So I would sit up watching television until dawn, old movies and sitcoms. Anything to keep my mind occupied with something other than the forest and what I had almost encountered there. My doctor prescribed sleeping pills, but they only made the nightmares worse, deeper and more vivid. So I stopped taking them and just learned to function on 4 or 5 hours of broken sleep. Learned to hide the exhaustion behind makeup and caffeine and forced smiles. 3 months after my rescue, I received a call from the FBI. An agent named Sarah Morrison, who was working on the case. She had read my statement to the park rangers, the one I had given right after being found, and she wanted to talk to me in more detail about my experience, specifically about the timing and location of where I had been. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory, somewhere public and safe, and when she arrived, she was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a direct manner that put me somewhat at ease. She ordered a black coffee, I ordered tea that I didn't drink, and she opened a laptop and pulled up a map of the forest, digital and detailed, with various markers and colored zones. She pointed to a red zone that covered several square miles in the valley. That's where we found the primary site, she said. And these yellow zones are locations where we believe they conducted surveillance and identified potential victims. Her finger traced a path on the map. This is approximately where you were according to your statement, and this is the direction you were heading. I looked at the map and felt my stomach drop. I had been less than a mile from the red zone, less than a mile from walking directly into their operation. If I had continued for another 20 or 30 minutes, I would have been there, would have seen them, would have been seen by them, and Agent Morrison confirmed what I already suspected based on the timing you described. They were almost certainly active that day. We found evidence suggesting they were in the middle of a ritual when you were in the vicinity. The sounds you heard were real. I told her about the eagle, even though I knew how it would sound. Described how it had been following me for days, how it had dived at me and forced me to change direction at the exact moment I was about to walk into danger. Agent Morrison listened without interrupting, taking notes on her laptop. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she closed the laptop and looked at me directly. "I'm going to tell you something that's not in the official reports," she said. "We found security camera footage from a hunting cabin about 2 miles from the site. The cabin was abandoned, but the cameras were still functional, running on solar power, and the footage shows something interesting." She pulled out her phone, scrolled through some files, and showed me a video, grainy and shot from a distance, but clear enough to see a person stumbling through the woods, exhausted and obviously lost, and above that person, circling, was a large bird, an eagle. I watched myself on that tiny screen, watched the eagle dive and force me to turn, watched the whole sequence play out exactly as I remembered it. "So it was real," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was all real." Agent Morrison nodded. "Birds are territorial," she said, "golden eagles especially. It's possible the eagle viewed the cult members as a threat to its territory, as invaders, and when you started heading toward them, it perceived you as potential prey walking into a competitor's trap. Animals are territorial about food, sources they don't like sharing, or," she paused, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, "or maybe it just decided you were worth saving." Some animals form attachments to specific areas and the creatures in them. There have been documented cases of wild animals protecting humans, though usually it's dogs or dolphins. Eagles are rarer, but not unheard of. Either way, that bird changed your trajectory at a crucial moment. If you had continued on your original path for another 15 minutes, you would have walked right into their line of sight. and given what we know about their methods, you wouldn't have made it out. The conversation with Agent Morrison changed something in me, knowing that the eagle had been real, that I hadn't imagined or hallucinated the whole thing. It gave me a strange sense of validation, but also deepened my obsession with understanding what had happened. I started researching eagles, reading everything I could find about their behavior, their intelligence, their territorial patterns. I learned that golden eagles can live for 30 years or more in the wild, that they mate for life, that they have incredible memories and can recognize individual humans. I learned that in some cultures, eagles are considered sacred, messengers between the earthly and spiritual realms, protectors and guides. And while I wasn't particularly spiritual or religious, I couldn't deny that something profound had occurred, something that transcended normal animal behavior. The eagle had made a choice, had acted with purpose, had intervened in a way that suggested awareness of consequences, and the more I learned, the more convinced I became that I needed to find it again, needed to return to that forest and see if the eagle was still there. If I could somehow thank it, somehow acknowledge what it had done, even if the bird couldn't understand my gratitude, even if I was projecting human emotions onto a wild creature, I needed to try, needed to close this circle that had been left open. I waited until the investigation had concluded and the area was fully reopened to the public, which took almost 6 months. The Forest Service had closed large sections during the investigation, had rerouted trails and posted warnings, but eventually they removed the restrictions and life returned to something approximating normal. And on a cool morning in October, almost exactly 1 year after my original trip, I drove back to the forest. This time I was prepared, had a proper GPS device, had filed a detailed itinerary with the park service, had enough supplies for 3 days, though I only planned to stay for 1. I parked at the same trailhead where I'd started my ill-fated hike. But this time I knew where I was going. I had studied the maps obsessively, had marked the location of the stream where I had found water, where I'd seen the eagle land and look at me with those intelligent eyes, where I'd felt that connection form. The hike took several hours, following marked trails. This time, no bushwhacking or getting lost, just a steady climb into the mountains. And as I walked, I felt a strange sense of peace. The forest didn't frighten me anymore, or rather, I understood it better now. I understood that it was neither good nor evil, just different, a natural space where life and death existed side by side, where beauty and horror could occupy the same territory, where a person could be lost and found, threatened and saved, all within the span of a few miles. I reached the stream in early afternoon. The water was higher than I remembered, swollen from recent rains, and the trees were turning colors, gold and red and orange, against the deep green of the evergreens. It was beautiful in a way I hadn't been able to appreciate during my ordeal. When survival had been the only concern, I sat on a flat rock by the water and unpacked some food, ate slowly, while watching the stream flow and listening to the sounds of the forest, birds calling, wind rustling through leaves, the distant sound of water cascading over rocks, and I waited. Didn't really expect anything to happen, didn't think the eagle would magically appear just because I had returned. But I waited anyway, because what else could I do? I had come all this way, had made this pilgrimage, and now I needed to see it through. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped. I put on an extra layer and continued waiting, watching the sky, scanning the treetops, looking for any sign of that distinctive silhouette, and just when I was about to give up, just when I was thinking that maybe this had been a foolish idea, that I was chasing something that couldn't be recaptured, I heard it, that piercing cry, that unmistakable shriek that sent shivers down my spine. And I looked up, and there it was, the eagle circling high above the stream, its wings spread wide, catching the late afternoon light, and my breath caught in my throat because this was real, this was happening. The eagle had returned, or maybe it had never left. Maybe it had been here all along, watching over this territory, and now I was back in its domain. The eagle descended slowly, spiraling down in those same wide circles I remembered, and it landed on the same branch across the stream, or at least what I thought was the same branch, and we looked at each other again, across the water, across the barrier of species and understanding, and I felt that connection reform. That strange bond that shouldn't exist but did. I stood up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, and I spoke to the eagle, told it everything I hadn't been able to say before, thanked it for saving my life, for guiding me away from horror, for being there when I needed something, anything, to hold on to. I told it about the nightmares and the investigation and the people they had found in that valley. Told it about how I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to joining them. And the eagle just sat there, head tilted, watching me with those penetrating eyes, and I knew it couldn't understand my words, knew I was probably just talking to myself, processing my own trauma out loud, but it felt important to say these things, to speak them into the world, to acknowledge what had passed between us in this place. And when I finished talking, I just stood there, tears running down my face, and the eagle made that soft clicking sound again, that almost conversational vocalization. And then it spread its wings and took off, but this time it didn't fly away, it circled lower, closer than I had ever seen it fly, close enough that I could feel the wind from its wings, could see every detail of its feathers, the powerful muscles moving beneath the plumage, the wickedly curved talons tucked against its body, and then it climbed again, climbed high into the sky. And I watched it go, watched it disappear into the vastness of the forest and the mountains beyond. And I knew with absolute certainty that this was goodbye, that I wouldn't see it again, that this moment was the closure I had been seeking. I hiked back out of the forest as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. And I felt lighter, somehow, as if a weight I had been carrying had finally been lifted. The nightmares didn't stop immediately. They continued for months afterward. But they were less frequent, less intense, and eventually they faded to occasional echoes, memories of memories. No longer powerful enough to wake me in a panic, I went back to therapy, talked through the experience with a professional who specialized in trauma, and slowly, painfully, I began to process what had happened, began to integrate it into my life story, rather than letting it define me entirely. I learned that I could carry this experience without being crushed by it, could acknowledge the horror of what I had almost encountered, while also recognizing the profound gift I had been given. The chance to continue living, to grow and change, and become something more than I'd been before that day in the forest. Years passed. I changed jobs, moved to a different city, built new relationships, and let go of old ones that no longer served me. I started volunteering with a search and rescue organization, using my experience to help find people who were lost in the wilderness, who were facing the same terror and confusion and desperate hope that I had felt, and every time we brought someone home safely, Every time we found a missing hiker or camper and saw the relief on their face and the faces of their loved ones, I thought about the eagle, about the random chance or divine intervention or whatever you wanted to call it that had saved me, that had given me the opportunity to be here, to help others, to make some small difference in the world. I never forgot, never stopped being grateful. Never stopped looking up at the sky when I was in wild places, searching for that distinctive silhouette, knowing I probably wouldn't see it, but looking anyway, because some connections transcend time and distance. Some debts can never be repaid, but can be honored through how you choose to live, through the decisions you make and the person you become in the wake of trauma and grace. I eventually wrote about my experience, not for publication initially, just for myself, a way of organizing my thoughts and memories, but a friend read it and encouraged me to share it more widely. So I posted it on a blog, anonymously at first, just putting the story out there without expectation or agenda. And the response was overwhelming. Thousands of people reached out, sharing their own stories of strange encounters in the wilderness, of animals that had behaved in inexplicable ways, of moments when nature had seemed to reach out and touch the human world with purpose. Some of the stories were clearly embellished or fantastical, but others had that ring of truth, that authentic quality that comes from genuine experience. And I realized I wasn't alone, that the boundary between the human and natural worlds was far more permeable than I had ever imagined, that consciousness and intention existed in forms we barely understood, that the universe was stranger and more wonderful and more terrifying than any philosophy could capture. Reading those stories, connecting with those people, became part of my healing process, became a way of honoring not just the eagle, but the mystery itself, the fundamental unknowability of existence that we try so hard to explain away with science and reason, but that sometimes breaks through anyway, showing us glimpses of something larger, something that operates by rules we don't understand. I've returned to that forest many times over the years, sometimes for search and rescue operations, sometimes just to hike and think and remember. The valley where they found the remains was permanently closed, turned into a memorial site with a simple stone marker listing the names of the victims. I visited it once, paid my respects, left flowers, and said prayers for people I never knew, but who had been denied the chance I received, the chance to walk away, to continue living, to grow old and wise and tell my story. And every time I visited, I would make my way to that stream, to the place where everything changed, where a wild creature made a choice that altered the course of my existence. The eagle's branch was still there, weathered and grey now, and I never saw the bird again. But I didn't need to. The connection remained, woven into the fabric of my being, a permanent reminder that life is fragile and precious, and full of mysteries that resist explanation, that sometimes we are saved by forces we don't understand, guided by hands we cannot see, protected by creatures that owe us nothing but give us everything. And the only appropriate response is gratitude, is living well, is passing on the grace we received to others who need it. Now, decades later, with grey in my hair and grandchildren who listen wide-eyed to my stories, I can look back on that time with something approaching wisdom, understanding that the eagle was both real and symbolic, both a physical being that made a choice and a representation of all the unseen forces that guide us through life's darkest moments. We are never as alone as we think we are, never as lost as we feel. There are currents and patterns and connections that bind us to each other and to the natural world, and sometimes, if we're very lucky or very blessed or simply in the right place at the right time, those connections become visible, become tangible, become the difference between life and death, and we are left with the responsibility of honoring that gift, of living in a way that justifies the chance we were given. The eagle taught me that, taught me to pay attention, to watch for signs, to trust in things I cannot fully explain, to respect the wilderness not as a place to conquer, but as a teacher, a guardian, a force that operates by its own logic and occasionally, inexplicably, reaches out to touch a human life with something that looks an awful lot like grace. And whether you call it instinct or intelligence, chance or choice, animal behavior or divine intervention, the result is the same. I am alive, I am here, I survived, and I owe that survival to a magnificent creature that circled above me in my darkest hour and decided, for reasons I will never fully understand, that I was worth saving, and that is the story I carry with me, the truth I hold in my heart, the memory that sustains me when life gets difficult and the world seems dark, because I know with absolute certainty that there is more to existence than what we can see and measure and explain, that mystery and magic still live in the wild places, that sometimes, against all odds and expectations, we are watched over from above, and that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.